Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar. I am Rakil Akali, Product Analyst at cloudlims.com, and I will be moderating this event. We are joined today by Mr. Stephen Goldman, who is going to present the webinar How to Meet Cannabis Testing Standards and Regulatory Requirements with LIMS Automation. Stephen, I extend a warm welcome to you. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few points so that you know how to participate in today's event. All attendees are in mute mode throughout this webinar. This is an interactive webinar, so we encourage you to ask questions anytime during the presentation by entering them in the question box. The questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. We will take as many questions as time permits. If we are unable to answer your questions today due to time constraint, we will answer them offline. It is time now to hand over the floor to Stephen. It's over to you, Stephen.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating in this webinar, and today we're going to cover how to meet cannabis testing standards and regulatory requirements with LIMS automation. My name is Stephen Goldman. I'm the Laboratory Director at Fida, which is a certified testing facility located in Denver, Colorado. Today, we are going to cover the market potential of the cannabis industry, speak a little bit about quality assurance and the regulatory compliance that goes along with testing in the cannabis industry, some of the challenges, both in running a lab as well as in using a LIMS system, and then take a deeper look at some of our systems here at Fida. So just to give us a little bit of perspective, the global cannabis market is fairly large, as we all know. According to Grandview Research, the market is expected to grow from 11.4 billion in 2015 to 55.8 billion in 2025, with an annual CAGR of 17.1%. So the market is extensive. As you might guess, North America is the largest subsection of that growth, followed by Europe, and then the Middle East, Africa, and Asia Pacific. Although the current governing statutes regarding legalized marijuana use vary in great detail from state to state, country to country, we now know what that's going to start to look like moving forward. Canada is medically approved, looking to approve recreationally in the coming months. And 29 states in the United States are approved for medical use, while 7 are approved for recreational use. What does this look like for a person basis? It means that 1 in 5 Americans now live in a state where recreational cannabis is legal. So it's starting to become significant swaths of the population. Lab testing services, therefore, appears to be a prime target for capital investment, including durable enterprise presence in the evolving cannabis industry. So what happens when we look at medical versus recreational cannabis? Recreational cannabis in 2014 was by far and away the smaller subsection as compared to medical cannabis. But when we analyze 2020 future projections, you can see that recreational cannabis actually overtakes medical cannabis in terms of use. This is all according to ArcView Market Research, and it looks like Florida's market is projected to grow to 1.6 billion by 2020, which makes it slightly bigger than Colorado's market, which is projected to be 1.5 billion. That also makes it about half the size of California's projected 2.6 billion. So these are massive markets that we're talking about. In terms of growth, diving in a little deeper in the numbers that I was just quoting, industry market research reports says that the cannabis market volume is expected to grow at a CAGR of more than 30% over the next 5 years. The U.S. Accounts for more than 95% of this growth. So this is what we're diving into a little closer here in this chart. And again, you can see the medical versus recreational cannabis breakdown, again at 22 billion estimated in the year 2020. But both of these markets, both recreational cannabis and medical cannabis, are very significant targets for investors and for growth. So what does this mean for testing? Well, testing is going to be a huge portion of that cannabis market. The global testing market is expected to reach 1.4 billion by 2021 just for cannabis testing, and it stood at an estimated 822 million in 2016. So that's a CAGR of about 12% during the forecast period of 2016 to 2021. This growth is mainly driven by factors such as legalization of medical cannabis and then recreational cannabis in various states and countries, coupled with the growth of cannabis testing laboratories within and across the nation. Um, Increasing awareness through conferences, symposia, workshops, news organizations, media are all contributing to an environment where people want safe products, whether it be the medical side or the recreational side. And so a lot of this thought is driving the growth of the cannabis industry. Based on products and software, the cannabis testing market is segmented into a lot of different segments. Analytical instruments, consumables, software, HR. There are a lot of different regions and growth areas that you would expect to grow. One of the larger ones is probably the consumables, which is companies like Sigma Aldrich or EWR, but we can get into that a little bit more in the question and answer period. As you can see here, the market size in 2021, again, North America is growing quickly now, especially in Canada. So we will dive in a little deeper in terms of what this huge cannabis testing market means in terms of labs. So what do cannabis labs look for? You know, two things really are important to the clients of labs as well as the end users, and that's potency and safety, far and away. Uh, Clients want safe products. They want to use these, whether they're on their medical side or the recreational side. They want them to be safe. They want them to be free of pesticides, free of solvents, free of metals. You can see the list here. There are lots of contaminants that labs need to test to ensure public safety at this level. And then there are dosing concerns, and that's usually defined as potency, depending on where you are in North America or the world. But potency is usually including full chemotype, which would be the concentration of individual cannabinoids like THC, CBD, as well as the concentration of terpenes in the products. So it's important to look at both. Related to potency is also strain validation. You know, a lot of grows are trying to validate their strains and come up with equivalent dosing and chemotype profiles, strain by strain. So that's an important part of potency, but not always included in the regulations depending on where you live. So methods in their workflows depending on the type of lab. You know, if you do extraction only, if you're grow only, if you only want to be a cannabis testing lab that supports strain validation, potency, and terpenes, or if you want to be a lab that supports full product safety and contaminant testing. You know, each of these situations drive very different pictures in terms of the laboratory, both in terms of the data that you're going to acquire and the QA/QC that you need to instill in order to ensure that the data you give to your clients is of highest quality. So here is a short breakdown of some of the cannabis testing aspects, some of the tests and some of the individual molecules that are important. As of last year, researchers have identified, I think the list is up to 144 cannabinoids, and they know that cannabis sativa includes over 750 molecules. So it's an extensive list. It's a plant with hundreds and hundreds of molecules, very complicated chemistry involved. Lab testing of cannabinoids is done primarily as a measure of psychoactive potency, concentration of those cannabinoids, as I was saying. Current laboratory testing looks at only a handful of these cannabinoids, and here we've listed just a few. But common in terms of compliance, here in the state of Colorado, we're only required to report 5 of the cannabinoids. So 5 of the 144 known cannabinoids are required to be measured here in Colorado. Now, many labs go above and beyond that threshold, but we will dive into that a little later in our case study of Fida. THC is the most commonly known cannabinoid found in cannabis. It's the one known for its strong anti-psychoactive effects, and many indications on the medical side aid in pain, sleep, appetite issues, things like that. THCV and THCA are also related cannabinoids. CBC is cannabichromene is a more popular cannabinoid as of late. It's not psychoactive, usually found in trace amounts from flowers, and some indications indicating anxiety and stress relief can be relieved through CBC use. CBG is maybe one of the most important medical cannabinoids. Um, Cannabidiol, it's non-psychoactive. Typically, we see it in around 35–40% of products here in Colorado. It acts as sort of a counter to THC, regulating its psychoactivity. It's also been used, obviously and famously, for epilepsy, anxiety, sleep loss, inflammation, stress, pain. We see it in a lot of different medical indications for cannabis use on the medical side as well as on the recreational side. CBG is another popular cannabinoid, and CBGA as well. It's actually the precursor, CBGA is, in plants to CBG and THC. So the production of those in plants is very interesting, as well as the breakdown of these cannabinoids, which involves numerous side reactions. One of which is oxidation to CBN. CBN is known to be mildly psychoactive, but present only in trace amounts in cannabis sativa, unless thoroughly oxidated, which can break down THC to CBN. Moving down the list here, terpenes are small volatile compounds, usually measured by laboratories during chemotype testing. They're important because we're starting to see research out suggesting an entourage effect. So not only are the cannabinoids interacting on human receptors, but they act differently when terpenes are present or absent. And here we're listing some of the terpenes, certainly not all of them. Again, there are hundreds and hundreds, and these terpenes come from all different types of plants, not just cannabis. Again, moving down the list, we want to now identify the safety, the tests important for safety and the molecules important for consumer safety. And those are mostly known as contaminants. So whether we're testing for pesticides, plant growth regulators, heavy metals, residual solvents, microtoxins, or other dangerous foodborne microorganisms, all of these are lumped together and known as contaminants in cannabis testing. So one of the hot issues in contaminants right now is pesticides. You know, pesticides are sort of in a position of the Wild West right now. It's illegal for government agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States, or the World Health Organization in internationally, as well as Health Canada up in Canada, to publish a list of how and which pesticides to use in cannabis, and importantly, what are action levels for those pesticides? Where do we say they're safe versus where do we say they're not safe? Similar. When we look a little deeper into the classes of these pesticides, you know, there are many ways to use pesticides and many different pesticides to use. Ivermectins are famous for being insecticides. They're also useful against mites in cannabis, which we know are common problems for cultivators locally, but also internationally. Carbamates function as insecticides as well, but they have slightly decreased dermal toxicities and higher rates of degradation. So important if you're applying in a grow to know some of these kinetics. Organophosphates function as the base of many of these herbicides and insecticides. You know, they're easy to react and to produce other insecticides from those bases. So they're you know, fairly popular in the industry as well. And pyrethroids function as the base of most of the pesticides that you know when you're searching throughout your home. Many of the household insecticides and insect repellents are made from pyrethroids. Heavy metals are another interesting type of contaminant in cannabis. In 2013, research from coming out of Washington State provided why they looked at some of these heavy metals. And they're known to be extremely toxic in humans, including many neurological disorders related to them. And cannabis accumulates. Cannabis is an accumulus plant, so cannabis can accumulate high levels of heavy metals from contaminated soils. So definitely something to look out for. It looks like most states are going to have a abbreviated list Here are listed a few of the heavy metals. Colorado is only interested in measuring 4 of these heavy metals: arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury. But depending on where you live, you'll look at more or less of these heavy metals as part of your testing regime. Moving along more, we get into residual solvents. So solvents are not something that's typically involved in the plant, depending on how they're grown. But when people are producing concentrates, oils, chaxes, bladders, shatters, waxes, things of that nature from the flower, they oftentimes are using solvents like those listed in order to do the concentration. This is achieved because cannabinoids are very hydrophobic, so you need an organic solvent such as these listed in order to achieve good concentrations. Famously, in 2013, Canadian Rick Simpson published a recipe for preparing cannabis extracts from naphtha, or petroleum ether, and this extract was hyped to cure, or at least aid in the curing of his skin cancer. Because of that, the solvent method of preparation using petroleum ether and naphtha grew in popularity. These are known to be purified from petroleum products, and we know that those products are nasty. So today, a lot of people at the industrial level aren't using naphtha or petroleum ether to concentrate their cannabinoids. They're using things like butane, ethanol, CO2, isobutane, and measuring these residual levels in concentrate materials is an important risk, or an important thing to look at for human safety. So residual solvents is often overlooked, but it's definitely an important test to run for any cannabis testing laboratory. And lastly, mycotoxins and microorganisms. These are microorganisms that can infect many food-borne products. Interestingly, the Food Safety Modernization Act includes measuring and controlling a lot of these microorganisms. But already we're seeing that they're applicable in cannabis. The University of California, Davis, just this year in February, reported that one of its patients had contracted an incurable fungal infection from inhaling aerosolized marijuana. Later, they looked at 20 marijuana samples from Northern California dispensaries and found many of these hazardous microorganisms listed here. Especially the Aspergillus strains are known to have pretty horrible effects leading to this death in California. So definitely a class of compounds that you want to pay attention to when looking at contaminants in cannabis. So knowing all of the steps and all of the things to look at from a cannabis lab perspective, how do you go about starting a cannabis lab? There are many things to consider. Which tests are you going to run? Who will your clients be? What are the regulatory standards in your area? What are your quality standards going to be? How are you going to participate in proficiency testing? How are you going to manage your personnel? How are you going to manage your data? How are you going to report to clients? There's a large swath of information that you're going to have to control in terms of any cannabis testing laboratory. So let's dive in a little bit. The International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation, or known as ILAC, is a body, an international body known for harmonizing laboratory procedures, and not only that, harmonizing the auditing bodies for laboratories. One good example of a standard to come out of that is ISO 1725. So ISO 1725 is extremely important for labs. ISO stands for the International Organization for Standardization, and 1725 is the standard for laboratories. You may also hear ISO 9001, which is the standard for people producing products, manufacturers, grows, things of that nature. And the reason that these are important is because this is a set of standards holding laboratories or holding manufacturers to a minimum level of quality. Without such, a lot of the practices are at risk, at higher risk for lower quality, for error, for misreporting, for poor analytical practice, for poor laboratory practice. And so really, as the cannabis industry starts to mature, we want to pay a lot of attention to labs complying with these set of standards, international standards. So what's the benchmark for testing? There's sort of a three-tier approach. The first tier includes providing objective evidence that the laboratory is using correct methodologies and testing procedures. So is a lab testing for potency using a method that is fully validated with appropriate QA/QC? Is a laboratory looking at pesticides the correct way with the correct type of detection to get down to a detection limit that's applicable for cannabis and for state regulations? The second tier is what are these labs doing to prove that they can do that? Are they submitting a complete application for accreditation to any approved accreditation body? So what we did at Fida is we hired A2LA to come on site and perform an ISO 1725 audit. We'll get into that a little more later during the case study, though. But these sorts of third-party audits are extremely important for any lab to prove from an outside source that QA/QC levels are high internally. And the third tier for any lab is to achieve a formal accreditation by a recognized accreditation body. And so, for instance, Fida is doing that with A2LA. So it's possible many states will allow a provisional period for labs to come up to meet certain benchmarks. Some states are coming out with pre-requirements that labs are ISO certified. Massachusetts has done that. California is proposing to do that as well. Now, whether or not there will be a little provisional period where labs can come up to those standards in terms of quality, that's yet to be seen. But I think as the cannabis markets continue to mature, many states who have not legalized will legalize and include in that legislation the requirement for labs to be fully certified in these international levels. So definitely something to be on everyone's radar. The other aspect is regulatory software. Each state has different packages that they contract with from some of these companies you see below to track a lot of their data, track seed to sale data to make sure that none of the cannabis is going to the black market. State governments usually utilize these seed to sale software vendors like Metric, BioTrack, Leaf Data to track all transactions from grow all the way to dispensary level. The state cannabis regulatory body is responsible for enforcing these laws. Here in Colorado, that's the MED. And oftentimes, these laboratories are participating in the seed to sale loop. And so the potency data, the safety data, the contaminant data that labs are producing need to interact with these software packages in order to properly label things that end up in dispensaries that customers are buying. So how is this process easiest? Well, there are a lot of different types of data that we want to include in any solution to do that. This is cannabinoid testing, pesticides, water activity. Any contaminant test that a lab is producing should end up in a software solution easily used for customers and clients. If my lab tests a water activity test and it indicates the presence of a microbiological contamination at higher risk, that's something that I want to be able to track and something that I want to be able to report with reliability. Similarly, proficiency testing, that's a fairly large, important task for labs to take. Proficiency testing is a third-party accreditation to demonstrate that a lab is doing things right, measuring things the right way, reporting things the right way, and meeting certain levels of quality through their procedures. So as more and more states roll out legalization and more certification through international accreditation bodies takes place, proficiency testing is of the utmost importance for cannabis testing labs to include. So what are some of the things that are important in terms of personnel? Well, analytical chemistry and microbiology are difficult things, right? So you need skilled scientific staff manning any of your cannabis testing labs. Here in Colorado, we have a requirement that anyone working in a lab has at least a degree in the scientific field as well as 1 year of experience in a regulated laboratory environment. So you can't just hire anybody off the street. You have to make sure that you have skilled personnel. Uh, in addition to that, you need to make sure that you have skilled personnel running the lab at the supervisory level as well as the upper levels, ensuring that the quality systems are in place, but also ensuring that the training programs necessary for the skilled scientific staff are in place. It's extremely important that training is documented and training is performed for all levels of staff in a cannabis testing lab. And so what's a typical workflow inside of a lab? There are many things that you need to be aware of and many things that are important for labs. The first thing is sampling, which is an extremely important aspect of cannabis testing or any testing. Sample collection is no trivial task, especially for a plant like cannabis. Once that sample comes on site, how do you accession it? How do you intake it into your lab? And then how do you process it? This changes test by test. I don't process a sample the same way that I would if I was running a micro test in terms of versus a potency test. Those are very different processes. And then what happens when the sample is put on an analytical instrument? Each lab is running 4 to 10 different types of instruments, and you need to control the type of data that's coming off, but also the sample information that's going on those instruments. And then what happens to the data? How are you analyzing the data? Who's analyzing the data? How are you reporting it to your clients? How are you generating reports? How are you ensuring that the right information is where it needs to be? So this process is it's no accident that it's circular, because in each point you need to control chain of custody, and there's an idea here called traceability. I need to be able to trace any sample that comes through the door and prove exactly what happened to it within my walls. How much mass did I take to subsample it? Where did it go? To which instrument did it run on? Who processed it? Which of my chemists weighed it? Which of my chemists put it on the instrument? What happened to the data? Who QA'd it? Who QC'd it? Who looked at the final report before it went to the client? When was it reported to the client? When was it reported to the state regulatory body? There are hundreds of questions that you need to have solid answers for in terms of traceability and in terms of chain of custody. So I hope I'm proving that the need for some sort of solution to manage all of this data, both quality data, sample data, but also traceability data, is huge and very high. So, getting into that, how do you document your audit trail? Where do you record your sample masses? Where do you record your sample volumes? How do you know which sample is for which type? At Fida we're running hundreds of samples each week, thousands each month, over 50,000 samples, 60,000 samples tested so far. These are massive amounts of data, and putting it into an Excel spreadsheet is one path I wouldn't recommend going down. And then pushing all of this data back out to Metric or BioTrap or MJ Freeway or any other software package is increasingly tedious, as you can imagine. So what are the solutions for these? The solution is a LIMS system. So the LIMS is an acronym, stands for Laboratory Information Management System. And basically you want to look for a LIMS system that achieves solutions for all of these problems we've just identified. How do you input client information? How do you input sampling information? How do you intake a sample? Do you give it a number? Do you give it a name? Do you give it a date? How do you prove where it goes from workstation 1 to workstation 2 to 3? All of these auditing requirements should be in any good LIMS package. It should also control SOPs. Which SOP are your chemists following? How did they actually prepare the sample? How did they weigh it? How did they take a volume? All of this should already be built into a LIMS system with chain of custody already built in, so that there aren't stacks of paper moving about your lab. You lose paper, you misprint on paper. Paper is a challenge to audit in itself, so automating all of these and making your lab electronic is an unbelievable advantage in the marketplace. Not only in terms of accuracy, but in terms of turnaround time. If all of these things are automated, your testing, QA, QC, and reporting is much faster. So that's one of the things that cannabis labs are very competitive on is turnaround time. And LIMS enables those labs that have a good LIMS system to have the fastest turnaround time in the industry. So let's talk a little bit more about Fida. When I started at Fida, we were using Excel spreadsheets with any number of macros built in to do all of the calculating of the individual potency concentrations, as well as doing paper chain of custody. As you can imagine, as sample volume grew at Fida, from doing 5 to 10 samples per week up to 1,000 samples per week, this became a major problem. So we implemented a LIMS system fairly early on here, and we're able to stay pretty competitive for a number of reasons. We go beyond the state-mandated 5 cannabinoids to regularly report 14 of the cannabinoids to our clients. And we use a LIMS system to do all of that. All of our calculations are involved in the LIMS system. All of our QA, QC steps are involved in the LIMS system. And very importantly, all of our non-conformities are tracked in the LIMS system. So you see some of the test types here that we run for solvents, potency, and microbial contamination testing. And not 100% of the time do things go right. So if we ever have a chemist not following SOP or an instrument has a problem, these are normal parts of running a lab, but you want to be able to document the error happening, and you want to document the corrective action, whether it be a correction or a corrective action. All parts of your quality management system and CAPA system need to be in a LIMS system so that you can track this. And we were able to accomplish that using a LIMS system. So if I get audited and regulators say, show me sample XYZ, I'm able to pull up every piece of information about that, including if we had a prep error and what the correction was on that sample. It's a very powerful thing for a lab to be able to show that much information during an audit. And our experience has been that auditors are fairly impressed with our system. So what types of tests are involved in our LIMS system? On the left, you'll see the testing services that are required by the state of Colorado, but on the right, you'll see that we also offer value-added services, and these are things that our clients can contact us for in order to get more information so that they can instill process control in their processes as well as meet the regulatory burden for testing. Some additional value-added services not on this list are stability studies. Anytime you have an edible or a chocolate bar or a cookie that you're going to sell in a store, you need to have an expiration date on that. How do you accurately date that? You do it through stability studies and accelerated stability studies. So we perform that for our clients as well. Genomic analyses, we perform a lot of plant and human pathogen identifications through DNA-based quantitation techniques and sequencing techniques, as well as mycotoxin testing, which is a HPLC assay we perform here. But the point is, incredible amounts of information from 10 plus different types of tests that we perform for our clients are all fed into a LIMS system and all managed easily with minimal staff. So these types of things are extremely important as a solution for a testing lab for cannabis industry. Some of the more specific reactions or analytical techniques that we're using to perform those tests are HPLC, GC, mass spec, quantitative polymerase chain reaction, qPCR. These are all fairly standard techniques in other laboratories and becoming more and more standard in the cannabis industry as well. Some of the microbiological techniques include DNA-based techniques. which would be using qPCR, or some of them are plating. So here in Colorado, we test for rapid yeast and molds using Petri films and other plating techniques as part of confirmatory testing. So there's a lot of inputs into any LIMS system that we need to be aware of and we need to control. So a lot of QA, a lot of QC for each of these different types of processes. So what does the workflow management look like at Fida? Previously, we went over a more general workflow, but this is sort of Fidatech's workflow. We are unable in Colorado to do our own sampling at the current time, so we're sort of at the mercy of our clients. What comes in the window is what we get to test, and there are a lot of problems with that, but not a topic from here. So what we do when we receive a sample is we intake it into the lab. We immediately input that information into a LIMS system, including all of the state-mandated information, such as the RFID tags that come along with the sample as part of C2CL tracking. We then prepare the sample depending on which type of test it needs to be performed for and run it on the instrumentation necessary. At that point, all of our instruments directly link up through an API with our LIMS system, and we're able to do all QA, QC, analyze all data, and generate all reports in the LIMS system. Once all QA, QC has been signed off on, our LIMS system also feeds directly into the state of Colorado's metric system, so we don't have to have employees manually input data into metric to be compliant. That process is all automated and automatic. And as a huge advantage for us, we also have a client portal. So once these reports are generated, the report populates the client portal, and automatically our clients are notified that there's a new report in their portal. Very nice as well. It's a very nice solution for invoicing. So any LIMS system can count the number of tests each client has had, and within a defined period, send out an invoice for billing those test services. So I hope you can see it's a fairly good solution for all of these different types of processes that we have going on at the lab at any time. And here are some of the highlights I just went over. A lot of the data entry and errors that Fida was making when we had an Excel-based and paper-based system are gone. There are no more nonconformities for silly things anymore at Fida. Manual data entry into the metric portal is instantaneous, so we save a lot of labor costs in doing some of the manual entry. All auditing is included in the LIMS system, including subtracting subsample masses from the intake in the sample, and as well when we dispose the sample, which is a highly controlled process in itself. All of that is also handled in the LIMS system. So at any time, if regulators come to our lab and ask me about a sample, I can immediately find it in the LIMS system and say, why, yes, we have 0.76 grams of that remaining, and I can tell you exactly where it's located. It's a very powerful system in terms of that. And what we've seen is our clients love it. They love the portal, they love the reports that we make, and they love the automatic invoicing. So things to keep in mind when finding a LIMS team or a LIMS solution is what are you going to use it for? Are you going to have it be a full package like Fida uses, or are you going to use it only for QA, QC, or only for your potency analysis? I think we've covered most of this, but auditing is one of the major powers of any LIMS system, and included in auditing is the chain of custody. So which of my chemists did what on what date and time, and all of those date timestamps are housed in any LIMS system. So it's incredibly powerful for all of these reasons. Here's an example of a Fida report. This is one of our older reports with some made-up data. But as you can see, it's easy to create a COA for your clients with different lots and batch numbers and different pie charts, whatever you want to show based on the test type. It's all very customizable. And indeed, many of the regulating bodies are going to require certain information be on a COA based on the type of test, and so you'll see a lot of that here. But the point is to show its customizability, and really it's visual quality in terms of clients as well as its practicality in Colorado. So that's all I have to discuss today. I hope to answer your questions and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Stephen, for the presentation. We are now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. We have close to 5 minutes for this Q&A session. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions box. We have a number of interesting questions, so I will move straight on to these. The first question is, how do we achieve regulatory compliance for cannabis testing labs in Colorado?
This is a great question. There are many aspects of regulatory compliance. Um, Certainly one of them is keeping chain of custody. Another one is reporting accurate results, including sales to the state of Colorado as well as to our clients. So it's extremely important anytime any one of the contaminant tests that we're testing for has a failing result, that's communicated quickly and clearly to our clients in the state of Colorado. Both of those goals are achieved, you know, in an automated fashion using a LIMS system.
All right. And we have a question from Harold Finch. The question is, how is the return on investment when LIMS are implemented?
It's very, very high, 10 to 1, 20 to 1. I think I'm able to automate the work that 2 to 3 chemists would be doing in my lab when I take into account all the aspects of the LIMS system. So on the salary wages side, it's very high, 6 figures.
All right. And we have a question from Carrie Ruth. She asks, how beneficial is it to implement a Metrac integrated LIMS?
Metric, yes. The data entry into Metric was a very laborious task. We had multiple chemists and biologists entering their data by hand, by analyte, one at a time into the metric system. So, each day I had hours of employee time entering data. Automating that process has been a huge gain in capacity for us. So I would say maybe even 10 to 20% gains in capacity overall.
Okay. And we have a question from Katie. She asks, how much did the testing turnaround time go down by using LIMS?
Again, I think we probably saved 10 to 20% in automating all of our QA QC steps as well as disseminating the reports and the data to our clients. So there was a significant drop in testing turnaround time as well, which in Colorado we know is one of the most competitive aspects of cannabis testing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Stephen, for the presentation. Unfortunately, the time is up for today. We are unable to take up further questions at this moment. However, we will reply to your questions as soon as possible. I would like to thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day ahead.